At this point, it may be useful perhaps to illustrate some of the problems at hand when preparing dialogue. Let's think about how typically in a system such as the EU, or perhaps also in the member states, how leaders prepare for upcoming dialogue. In most places, there is a standard practice of producing a briefing book. This briefing book is in turn based on reports by embassies, delegations, etc. And in the case of the EU, it may be a dialogue undertaken by the High Representative, the President of the European Council, the President of the European Commission, etc. Clearly, the briefing needs to contain proposals for key messages in specific situations for the meeting in question. But in reality, given the number of briefing requests, the chances are that the product will be less than satisfactory. Why? Well, what a typical desk officer does is to propose to look for an earlier similar briefing on which basis he or she updates to fit the current setting. Well, and then he or may not have found adequate political reports to update the situation. So it's likely to be more of the same. I don't know how the current leadership handles this problem, but I know from my own experience in the past, and not least from the interviews that I conducted for my handbook on EU and security, that the problem has been significant over many years. It's resulted in the External Action Service issuing instructions about political reporting, and there are constantly, of course, updated templates for how briefings should be prepared. There is no secret that, and this happens in almost every country, I suppose, and also in international organizations around the world, that this is not easy. When you go down to the delegation or the embassy level, there is another problem. Who prepares the political reports? Well, often delegations reports periodically, weekly or monthly, and often these reports are quite voluminous, so they are built on earlier templates and examples of earlier reporting. Sometimes reports are being prepared by local agents. In the case of multilateral delegations, a large number of interns report for meetings. And meetings are numerous in international organizations, as we all know. The reports have to be delivered quickly. To rewrite and synthesize such periodic reporting means a lot of work. And the number of officials that can do that kind of work is, in the case of the EU delegations, actually very small. More often than not, those who should do the job are already caught up in preparing for the next meeting. And sometimes, in the case of geographic delegations, reporting is prepared not in view of Brussels, but in view of the needs of the head of delegation or of the special representative, etc. So, the head of delegation may need a lot of detail, may accept a lot of specialized language, may accept acronyms, etc., all of which is not understood outside the specific line of command. So what does a hierarchy need? Well, beyond the need to know what should be said, they need an image, a picture of the situation as perceived from the EU perspective, and ideally also from the perspective of the interlocutor. Sometimes this means presenting several complementary perspectives, for instance in the case of the neighborhood or the enlargement context, when on the one hand the crisis response perspective and on the other the enlargement and accession perspective need to be balanced and combined. The briefing book needs to propose a balance in the messages based on such complementary perspectives. It will not just be enough to adopt a linear approach, taking the dialogue one step further from the previous meeting, or just repeating the positions taken at the previous meeting. New information needs to be factored in, and often in a very synthetic way in order to be able to be taken into account. And here it's really true what many people say, it's more difficult and takes more effort to be brief than presenting a long text. And one also needs to think about the reality as it presents itself to the desk officer who is preparing the brief at headquarters level. He or she may be recently rotated into the post. He or she may not be aware of the local situation in the area under discussion. He or she may never have been in the region, not least due to the lack of mission budget. And he or she may find it difficult to convince all the different levels of hierarchy about the necessary changes in comparison to earlier briefs. And finally, he or she may have very little time to prepare the brief, since the deadlines must allow for the hierarchy to look at the briefing proposal. So when saying that the briefing needs to include real questions and to be asked in real adapted messages to put forward, this is not a small thing to ask for. Exactly how much this is in terms of requirement becomes even more obvious when one considers the need to distribute the material horizontally in the organization and even outside the organization when it comes to political reports. Look at the language in the global strategy, which talks about a responsive union in diplomacy, CSDP development, requiring an investment into the knowledge base underpinning external action. It also talks about information sharing and joint reporting, analysis and response planning between member states, embassies, EU delegations, Commission services, EU special representatives, CSDP missions, and even further, a cross-fertilization between the EU and regional and international organizations, civil society, academia, even private sector. And this should be done both in traditional ways, through dialogue, cooperation and support, also through innovative formats such as exchanges, embedded personnel, joint facilities, harnessing knowledge and creativity in the system. This is enormously high requirements, not small words or small ambitions. In my view, this also clearly requires a developed format for contingency planning, because in most cases there will not be time enough to produce reporting and briefings which are really creative, unless you have started a bit earlier. So this is not only the issue of producing good reports, courses are provided for that. It is also an issue of making them understandable for readers with non-specialized backgrounds, and again one has to be aware of acronyms. More often than not, the same acronym actually exists, stands for different things depending on the context. And one has always to keep in mind that the objective is dialogue. So if the Union is going to be truly responsive as required by the global strategy, it means to be able to anticipate reactions, questions, comments from interlocutors. To see this as a thesis, antithesis, then you need a synthesis which takes the expected response into account. And it's typically bad diplomacy to have the thesis repeated in its original format as a response. You need to be able to demonstrate that you have listened and taken into account what your interlocutor says. And then I haven't even mentioned the whole issue about security of information. The fact that the information needs to be classified depending on the level of sensitivity of the information, and distributed, taking into account the security clearances of staff, not least horizontally. Respecting the communication channels which are accredited for different levels of communication, be it a document which is classified EU restricted, EU confidential, EU secret, or God forbid, EU top secret. I suppose that most people know about the traditional ambassador stereotype in member states who love to send ciphers or confidential reports to his or her foreign minister, thus to making sure that they would be read. Well, in the EU system and probably also in member states nowadays, sending a message which is cumbersome to handle at headquarters level often misses a train if people really respect security regulations. The solution necessary in most cases, if you want to include the messages in a briefing book, which needs to be read in the car or in the aeroplane or on the way to the meeting, on the other side of the globe, is to declassify information by reporting sensitive data separately.